Solo show, team show, interview show, maybe. Don't take the decision for how to pick the best podcast format for your show lightly. Yes, of course, you could change formats down the line, but when somebody starts loving a podcast, one of the reasons is because it feels familiar. So changing later can be kind of jarring for your loyal listeners, which you're going to have, right? So let's get this decision right from the beginning. As a podcast consultant, I get asked all the time about the best format for different situations. So in this video, I'm going to walk you through the 3 most common podcast formats and share the pros and cons of each one so that you can choose the best one for your specific situation. And if you're thinking, I'm a free spirit, I don't need a format. First of all, I love it. But brain science has shown over and over again that when your podcast is properly formatted, it's much easier for people to consume and remember later on. And if you're wondering how long each episode should be, this has actually changed in recent years, and so make sure you stay to the end and I'll fill you in on that. By the way, my name is Jerry Potter. Yes, it rhymes with the boy wizard. I currently host 2 podcasts, have done others in the past, and consult people on podcasts for their business as well. And the first one we're going to look at is the solo podcast. This is just one person, like this, me, right now, talking into a microphone, no guests, no co-hosts, no sidekicks. And the biggest upside of the solo show is it is the quickest and easiest to do, right? You don't have to rely on anybody else. You just go in and you start recording. And they're easier to edit because they're much more predictable. When you have 2 people having a conversation, it's much more likely to go off on a random tangent or somebody will lose their train of thought or something where you're gonna have to do a lot more editing later. It's much easier to edit yourself when you know exactly what you said and how you speak. But a couple of cons for the solo podcast is you have to come up with all of the content yourself. These other 2 formats we'll look at here in just a second, that's just not true. So it's kind of more work in that way. And with the solo podcasts, your guests are not going to share the episodes because your guests, well, they don't exist, right? Because you're not having guests. So that's another downside of the solo show. Next, let's look at interview podcasts. Both of the shows that I host are interview shows, both my main podcasts for my business, The 6 Ways, a show for action-oriented entrepreneurs, which you can find on my YouTube channel or in your favorite podcasting app, as well as hosting the Social Media Marketing Talk Show for Social Media Examiner, another interview show. So lots of experience here, and here's what I found to be the pros and cons of interview shows. Pros for the interview format: the number one awesome thing about an interview show is you don't have to bring all the content. In fact, you don't have to bring most of the content if your format is just interviewing other people about what they do and their expertise, because they're coming in with that. Now, you do want to, of course, prep for your interview, but a lot of pressure is off compared to essentially doing a monologue on a solo format podcast like we talked about in the first example. And then the other big upside for an interview show is your guests will often share the episode with their audience if they have one, especially if you make it easy for them by providing clips and different things like that. So those are 2 big upsides for doing an interview show. All right, let's look at the cons, the downside of doing an interview show. First of all, the booking, right? You have to find quality guests. You have to book them. You may have to rebook them if they cancel. Another thing with this is there's more tech involved if you have somebody that's in another location, or even if they're in the same location too, but if they're in another location and their internet signal isn't good. So there's a lot of variables and a little bit of extra work with all of that, just having an interview in every episode or even in some of your episodes. Another con of the interview show is they're a lot less predictable, which can mean more editing. When you have 2 people having a conversation, you're much more likely to go off on a tangent, especially if it's a guest you don't know very well. And the last thing to remember with interview shows is if you only do interviews and you have the guest come in every time, your podcast is not likely to build your authority. So for a lot of entrepreneurs, that's one of our number one goals. We want our podcast to build our authority. And what you're doing is you're giving all of the authority on the podcast to your guest. So if that's the case and you want to build your authority, it's just something to consider. So maybe you do some solo and some interview, or if you want to hear an example with how to keep the authority for the host and the guest, definitely check out an episode of my podcast, The 6 Ways, and you'll hear how we've achieved that in there. All right, let's talk about team shows. This is 2 people that are co-hosting, or maybe a host and a sidekick, but basically every episode is you having a conversation with somebody else that's always there, not a guest that changes every single episode. So the pros, the number one pro for this is you don't have to come up with all the content. I mean, if they're a co-host, you also don't have to do all the marketing or all kinds of things, right? You have two people that you can divide the work between, and that can make a massive impact. The other big pro for doing a team show is simply the fact that some people are more comfortable with this. If you don't like your voice, or silence is uncomfortable, or any number of things, we all have these mindset issues where sitting in a room by yourself talking, whether you're talking to a camera or not, can feel really weird and uncomfortable. So that's another pro of a team show. Now, there are quite a few cons or risks involved with doing a team show. So let me run through them here really quick. First of all, chemistry can be really hard to come by. Just because you and another person love the same topic, or maybe you have great conversations normally, it doesn't mean you'll be able to do it consistently for 100 episodes. And the other thing too is sometimes when people love talking about the same things, creative differences can destroy the relationship. If you are splitting the workload, you remember doing school projects with, group projects in school, and then it's like, well, they didn't do their share and they didn't do their share. Podcasting becomes very unpleasant when you get into that kind of stuff. So that's just something to keep in mind going forward. Just like if you were going to start a business with someone else, if you wouldn't start a business with this person, you may not want to co-host a podcast with them. Another downside is if you have multiple voices and they're not very different. If you have a man and a woman and one voice is high and one voice is low, it's fine. But if you have, I have a friend that I swear we have almost the same voice. If we hosted a podcast together, nobody would know who was who, especially on the audio side. And finally, it can be harder to develop a brand as a team show unless your roles on the show and your personalities are very distinctly defined. If it just sounds like two similar people talking the whole time, after a few episodes, it all kind of starts to sound the same. So which one are you thinking about? Solo, interview, or team show? I would love to know in the comments. And I promise to talk about how long a podcast episode should be in this day and age, because things have definitely changed over the last couple of years. Now, the generic answer I give for any type of content, if somebody says, how long should my Facebook Live be? How long should my YouTube video be? It's as long or as short as it needs to be. No matter what you hear about watch time or listening time or whatever, never lengthen something just for the sake of it, but also never cut something so short that it doesn't make sense anymore or the value is not there anymore because you've decided I have to stay under 20 minutes or whatever the number might be. The big upside of longer in podcasts is you can develop more loyalty. So when I work with my clients and members, we teach something called the DATE framework, and it's about taking somebody from stranger to buyer. And a longer episode could move somebody who's never heard of you all the way forward to them becoming a buyer because they've spent more time with you. But if the content isn't good to them and they tune out halfway, then that whole thing breaks and doesn't make sense anyway. And finally, and I think this is the big shift that we've seen over the last year or two, is now that video podcasts are getting bigger and more people are watching podcasts on YouTube, there is a different expectation. When you put a podcast on your phone and you start driving, or you put it in your pocket because you're working out or whatever it might be, you don't always go back and change the podcast. Like, you give it a longer chance. But on video, the expectation is higher. So you want to get in and deliver a good product quickly. And by the way, we should be doing that for our audio podcasts too. As the quality of podcast goes up, these long, rambly things that people have accepted for many years in podcasting, it's not going to be acceptable anymore. I think listenership for those shows is going to go down. So think about those factors when deciding how long each episode should be. Because again, if you're trying to generate leads with your podcast, but nobody makes it to the call to action when you say, by the way, if you'd like to work with me, or if you'd like to buy my thing or join my email list, then what's the point, right? If you are trying to generate leads with your podcast, by the way, I found 3 things that work really well, and it's what I've been using with my clients that I consult on their podcasts, and I put together a little resource for anyone else that is interested. 3 ways to triple the leads you get from your podcast. If you'd like it, find the link in the description of this video. And don't stop there. We've linked to a couple of other videos that you might find helpful as well on the screen right now. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next video. Bye.